The lamp had gone blind. Elsie Vare stood in the lantern room at the top of the tower, with the storm screaming against the glass, and where the great beam should have been throwing its light 10 miles out over the water, it was only a dull smear. The freezing rain had glazed the outside of the glass with ice faster than she could scrape it clear. Her hands were bare. You cannot trim a wick or work the fine brass of a lamp in mittens, and so she worked without them, in a room that stood below freezing at the panes, warming the thickened oil against the lamp with fingers she had stopped being able to feel an hour before. Below her, down the iron spiral of the stair, there were people. She could hear them. Not one or two, a crowd, come up out of the dark and the ice to the one place on the point still standing. It was the worst night the lake had thrown at that shore in 20 years, and by every arrangement written on paper, Elsie Vare had no business being in that tower at all. The Lighthouse Board had a man in mind for her post. The letter had come in November, courteous and final. A station of that class was kept by a man. A man had been appointed. He would take up the light when the ice went out in the spring. She had no husband. A fever had taken Samuel in October. No sons. No name of her own on the keeper's roll. Only 9 years of her own 2 hands. What none of them understood, not the board, not the town freezing in the dark below, not the ships out on the black water, was that she was not only lighting a lamp, she was doing something with the light that the man from the board had never learned to do. And before that night was over, the same men who had measured her for the door would be climbing her stairs in the dark, hats in their hands, waiting to be let in to the warm. But that was the worst night, and the worst night came last. This began 5 months earlier, in October. The light stood on a spit of black rock that ran out into Lake Michigan a quarter-mile past the last house of the town. And in 9 years, Elsie Vare had come to know it the way you know your own hands in the dark. It was not a grand station. A round stone tower, 60 feet to the gallery, whitewashed and weathered. A keeper's house built onto its foot, low and thick-walled. A storehouse. A boat slip cut into the rock where the station's rowboat rode. At the top, behind the storm panes of the lantern room, the great lamp threw its beam 10 miles out over the water, and the ships that ran the lake by night ran by it. The oar boats, the timber schooners, the little fishing craft that worked the shoals. Samuel had kept the light for 9 years. Elsie had kept it with him for every one of them, in all but the title. That was the thing the world beyond the point never quite saw. On paper, Samuel Vare was the keeper, and Elsie Vare was the keeper's wife, and on the rock there was no such division. She trimmed the wick as often as he did. She hauled the oil up the 60 feet of spiral stair. She stood the black middle watches turn and turn about, so that a man who had been up since the 4 o'clock lighting could sleep 3 hours before dawn. Whatever Samuel knew about the lamp and the lake and the long winters, he knew out loud, at the supper table, on the stairs, and Elsie had been listening for 9 years. The craft was his by trade. It was hers by heart, and she had never once had reason to say so. Then, in October, a chest fever came up the lake with the first hard weather. It settled into Samuel the way those fevers did in men who had spent their lives in the wet and the wind. And in 2 weeks, he was gone. They buried him in the town churchyard within sight of his own light. On the night of the burial, and every night after, Elsie climbed the stair at dusk and lit the lamp, because the ships were still on the lake, and the light could not be let go dark for one man's grief. She did not decide to keep the light. She simply did not stop. The letter from the Lighthouse Board came in November. It was not an unkind letter. It thanked Mrs. Vare for maintaining the light through a difficult season and offered the board sympathy for her loss. Then it explained, in the flat, courteous language of an office far from the water, that the keeper of a station of that class was, by the board's standing practice, a man, that a keeper had accordingly been appointed, and that he would take up the post when the ice went out in the spring. Mrs. Vare was welcome to remain in the keeper's quarters through the winter. Come the thaw, the station would be his. Elsie read it twice, folded it, and set it in the tin box on the mantel where the station papers were kept. She did not answer it. There was nothing in it a letter of hers could change. There was only the winter between her and the spring, and the winter, at least, did not care whether she was a man. She was not alone on the rock. Her daughter Nan was 15 that winter, and half a keeper already. She could light the lamp and trim the wick and stand a watch, and she loved the tower the way her father had. And there was Halloran, the old assistant keeper, who had been on the station longer than the Vares had. But in November, hauling a barrel up from the slip, Halloran had gone down on the iced-over rock and broken his hip, and he could not climb the stair now, nor would he all that winter. He kept to the lower room and did what he could, which was to mind the log and to talk Elsie down off the worst of the nights when her nerve wore thin. It left the tower itself, the 60 feet of stair, the lamp, the oil, the ice, to a widow and a girl. There was a thing Samuel had told her once, on a night years back, that she thought little of at the time and would have every reason to remember later. A schooner had come in blind in a snow squall, running for the harbor, and the harbor mouth had one gap of deep water through the shoals, with rock on either side of it. And Samuel had stood at the lamp and worked it, not just lit, but worked, turning and shading it so the beam lay along the line of the safe channel like a road laid down in the dark water. The schooner had found the gap and come through. Afterward, Samuel had said, in the offhand way he said the truest things, that any fool could light a lamp. A stranger out there saw a light. A keeper showed him the road. Elsie had nodded and thought little of it. It was only her husband talking about his trade. And there was one more thing she knew about the tower without ever having been taught it, the way you know a house you have lived in. It was warm. The great lamp burned all night and threw off its heat along with its light, and the iron of the lantern floor and the thick glass and the little round room at the top took that heat and held it, and it sank down the spiral of the stair into the quarters below. The base of the tower was stone and brick 4 feet thick, and stone that thick takes the whole day to cool and the whole night to give its warmth back. On the coldest mornings of her married life, when the town's frame houses along the shore woke with frost on the inside of the windows, Elsie had climbed the stair to the lantern room to get warm. The ice came early that year. In the last week of October, the lake began to smoke on the still cold mornings, the way it does when the water is warmer than the air, and a skin of ice crept out from the rocks of the point where there should have been open water for a month yet. The old fishermen in the town stood on the shore and looked at it and did not like it. They had seen early ice before, and they knew what it told them. It meant a long winter and a hard one. Come to sit down on the lake and not get up again until spring. The first great blow of that winter came down the lake in the second week of December, and Halloran knew it before the glass did. He had been on the lakes 40 years, and the old break in his shoulder and the new one in his hip kept a barometer of their own. On the afternoon of the 9th, he told Elsie from his cot in the lower room that they would have weather by dark, bad weather out of the northwest. And when she went out to look, the sky had already begun to lower, flat and gray and pressing down on the water like a lid coming onto a pot. The needle of the station's barometer had fallen a full tenth in the hour. She had watched Samuel read that same falling needle 100 times and go quiet and start making the tower ready. And she felt the want of him then, sharp, in the pit of her. She made the tower ready the way she had watched him make it ready. But the way she had watched him make it ready was in the summers, in the mild weather, when she stood the watches and he ran the station. And there was a whole half of the keeper's craft that had always been his and that she had never had to hold in her own head. She trimmed the wicks and filled the lamp and set the night's reserve of oil ready to hand. The reserve stood where it always stood, in the storehouse, against the outer wall, in its can. She did not think about the wall. That was the whole of it. In summer, the wall meant nothing. In December, against the outside of a stone building with the northwest wind driving on it, the wall was the coldest place on the station, and the oil that stood against it thickened in the cold to something slow and sullen, and a lamp cannot burn what it cannot draw. Samuel would have known to bring the reserve inside, to keep it by the stove, to carry it up warm. He had known it so long he had never thought to say it, and so it was one of the few things she had not heard him say, and it was the thing the first storm found. The blow came on after dark, hard, the snow driving level off the lake. Elsie lit the lamp at dusk, and it burned clean and bright, and for the first hours the beam swept out strong through the snow. Then, toward midnight, it began to fail. Not all at once. The flame thinned and shrank, guttered low in the cold that came up the tower, and the beam that should have reached 10 miles reached half of that, and less. She went for the reserve to freshen the lamp, and found it cold as the wall it had stood against, thick and slow in the can, no help to her at all. She did what she could, coaxing the wick, warming what oil she could hold near the flame in her hands. But the beam ran weak and yellow through the worst hours of the night, when the men on the water most needed it strong. And there were men on the water. A fishing boat off the town, caught out when the blow came up faster than the sky had promised, had turned and run for the harbor by the one light it trusted, and lost it in the snow when the beam ran weak, and in the losing wandered off the safe line and struck the rocks of the reef that ran out from the point's north side. The men were taken off in the morning, cold to the bone but alive, clinging to the wreck where it had jammed on the rocks. The boat itself was broken to pieces before the light came up. No one blamed her. The town said it was a bad blow, and boats are lost in bad blows. But Elsie stood on the gallery in the gray morning and looked down at the wreck on the rocks, and she knew what the town did not, that the light had run weak on her watch, and that a light running strong might have held those men on the safe line all the way in. She had kept the watch the way she had kept it in summer, and the winter had shown her the difference, and the difference had cost a boat, and come within a hair of costing 4 men. She did not sleep that day. That night she sat in the lantern room with the cold can of oil beside her, and made herself learn the thing the storm had taught her. She carried the reserve up out of the storehouse and set it inside, by the stove in the quarters, and she carried the night's working oil the whole way up the tower and stood it in the lantern room itself, near the warm lamp, so that when the flame wanted feeding, the oil that fed it would be warm and quick and willing. And she resolved that she would not let it stand and cool through a single night of that winter, that she would carry it and warm it and keep it moving up and down the stair, however many times a night the cold demanded. It was, she understood, exactly what Samuel had done and never named. She could see it now, looking back, how on the hard nights he had gone up and down the stair more often than the lighting itself required, how there had always been a can by the lamp, how he had never once let the reserve go cold. She had watched him do it for 9 years and taken it for the ordinary restlessness of a careful man. It was not restlessness. It was the second thing a keeper had to know, after how to light the lamp, that in a lake winter the light must be fed and fought for, that the cold will starve the flame if you let it, and that a keeper's work is not to light the lamp, but to hold it strong through the whole long freezing dark. The next blow came 4 nights later, and she met it the new way. She kept the working oil warm by the lamp, and the reserve warm by the stove, and she went up and down the 60 feet of stair through the whole night, feeding the flame warm oil, clearing the frost that tried to gather on the inner glass, trimming the wick close so it burned clean and hot. Her legs ached, and the stair grew treacherous with the ice her own wet boots carried up it, and twice she had to stop on a landing and stand shaking with the tiredness. But the flame stood fat and steady, and the beam went out strong through the snow, 10 miles and more, all night long, and never once thinned. A week of hard weather proved it out. With the oil kept warm and the glass kept clear, the light held its full reach in any cold the lake could throw at it. She stopped losing the beam. The boats that ran late for the harbor in the December blows found it where it should be, strong and steady, and came in on it. She had lost one boat learning the lesson. She did not mean to lose another. Then, in the last of the December mail that came out to the point before the ice closed the road, there was a second letter from the board. This one was shorter. It informed Mrs. Vare that, the station being held through the winter by other than an appointed keeper, an inspector of the district would call at the light before the spring to assess its condition and the manner of its keeping, and to report to the board. It did not say what the report might find, or what would follow if the report were poor. It did not have to. Elsie folded it and set it in the tin box with the first, and understood that the winter had grown a second set of eyes, that from now until the thaw, Every night she kept the light, she was keeping it, watched, and that the smallest failure of the beam would not be a private grief between her and the rocks, but a line in a report that would decide whether the door she had been shown in November was one she walked through or not. Halloran's hip turned bad in the middle of December. It had been mending slow, in the way of an old man's bones, and then a heat came into it, and a swelling, and the doctor, who came out over the shore ice on foot to see him, said the word Elsie had been afraid of. The brake had not set clean. Halloran would keep the lower room for the rest of that winter, and perhaps for good, and he must not put his weight on it, or try the stair on any account. That was the end of the last pair of hands on the station that was not her own or the girl's. The 60 feet of stair, the lamp and the oil, the slip and the storehouse and the ice, all of it came down now to a widow of 41 and a girl of 15. And Elsie, with the inspector's letter in the tin box and the spring in front of her, made the mistake a frightened person makes. She tried to carry it all herself. She would not let Nan stand the black middle watches, the cold ones, the ones where the beam had to be nursed against the worst of the night. She took those herself, every one, and gave the girl the easier evening and the dawn. She told herself it was to spare the child. Some of it was that the child was 15 and she was the mother. But some of it, and she knew it even then, was that the report was coming, and she wanted every hardest hour of the light kept by her own 2 hands, so that no fault of the keeping could ever be laid to a girl who should not have had to keep it at all. The trouble with carrying it all herself was that no one can. A keeper sleeps in the day so as to hold the night. Elsie was not sleeping in the day, because in the day there was the wood to get in, and the stores to mind, and the old man to tend, and the girl to feed. And so she went into the black watches already tired, and came out of them more tired still. And the tiredness stacked up in her the way snow stacks against a wall, higher every day, until she was making the small, dull mistakes that tiredness makes. She spilled the oil. She miscounted the stores. She forgot, one hard afternoon, to fill the lamp in the lower room where Halloran lay, and she went up to the black watch and slept the little sleep she allowed herself, and the lower room ran dry in the dark. It was Nan who found it, the lamp guttering out down in the lower room, old Halloran unable to rise and fix it, the last of the day's oil gone. And Nan, who was her mother's daughter, did not wake Elsie, because her mother had slept 2 hours out of the last 40, and the girl could not bear to take one of them. She took the can and a lantern and went out in the dark to the storehouse for oil. And the way to the storehouse ran along the edge of the boat slip, and the slip was sheeted in ice. She went down on it. Her feet went from under her on the black ice, and she came down hard, and she slid, and the slip ran down into the water, and for a moment she would not speak of for a long while after, she was sliding toward the open black water at the foot of it, with nothing under her hands but ice. She caught the edge of the timber cribbing at the last of it. She tore both palms open on the ice and the rough timber catching herself, and she lay there in the dark with her legs over the water and her ruined hands screaming, and held on until she could get her breath and her feet and crawl back up. Elsie woke to the girl standing white in the doorway of the quarters, hands wrapped in her apron and the blood coming through, and she got the story out of her a piece at a time, and each piece was worse than the last. Nan's palms were laid open. She would carry the scars of that slip across both hands for life, though the hurt of it healed by the turn of the year. The oil had nearly gone under the ice, and Elsie had slept through all of it, 3 feet from her own child, because she had been too proud and too frightened to let anyone carry the station but herself, and the carrying it alone had come within 1 skid of ice of drowning her daughter in the dark. She did not make that mistake again. In the gray days after, sick with it, she took the station apart in her mind and built it back the right way. She divided the watches honest. The 2 of them turn and turn about, the way she and Samuel once had. Nan trusted with what a girl of 15 could truly hold and no more, and Elsie sleeping in the day like a keeper must, so that she could hold the night like one. She gave Halloran the log and the counsel and the long thinking, which he could do flat on his back and was better at than either of them. And in the taking apart, she saw, clear for the first time, What had been keeping the three of them alive while she wore herself to the bone, fighting the winter alone? It was the tower. The great stone tower with its 4-foot base and its lamp burning warm at the crown of it held the day's heat and the fire's heat and let it down the stair. And the thick-walled lower room where Halloran lay was warmer on the worst nights of that December than any frame house on the whole shore of the town. Samuel had known the tower was a fortress. She had lived in it 9 years, and only now, alone in it, understood the thing she was standing inside. So she kept it like a fortress. She drew the station in tight for the deep of the winter, banked the heat in the lower room and the lantern, and let the rooms between fend for themselves. Shipped the ice off the slip each morning, and threw sand and ash on it so no one would go down on it again. Strung a rope along the wall of the spiral stair for a handhold, so that a keeper coming down half asleep with a hot can of oil had something to hold that was not the dark. Kept the oil up top, and the reserve by the stove, and the wicks trimmed and dry. The station shrank to a small, warm, strong thing at the center of the ice, and the winter leaned on it all through the last of December and could find nothing to take hold of. The inspector came in the second week of January, out over the shore ice, with a man from the town to guide him, a spare, gray official of the district with a coat too good for the weather and a way of looking at a station as though he were already writing it down. He went over the light with a cold thoroughness. He climbed the stair slowly, holding her new rope, and looked at the lamp and the wicks and the glass, and read the log Halloran had kept in his careful hand, and stood in the lantern room while the beam swept out over the frozen lake, and he could find nothing wrong with any of it. The light was flawless. The station was sound. The log was better kept than most he saw. He said as much in his dry way, and Elsie let herself think for one foolish moment that flawless might be enough. It was not. He told her, standing in her own warm lantern room, that a station of that class was, by the practice of the board, kept by a man, that her keeping of it through a hard season was creditable and would be noted, and that the appointed keeper would take up the post when the ice went out, as arranged. Her work was not the question. The rule was the question, and the rule was older and stronger than one winter's flawless light. He wrote his report at her own table before he left, and she did not read it, and he did not offer it. He left a letter from the board when he went. It was the thing the first 2 letters had not quite been, particular. It gave the appointed keeper a name, a Mr. Amos Reddick, late of a station down the lake, a keeper of some years' standing, and it gave the thing a date, or near enough. Mr. Reddick would come out to take up the post as soon as the ice would let a boat land in the spring. Up to then, the letters had been a rule, an office, a practice. Now they were a man with a name who would climb her stair in April and be handed her light. The spring had a face on it now, and the face was not hers. That night she took stock of the storehouse by lamplight, because the inspector's visit had reminded her that the winter was not only the boards to worry over. The oil, the wicks, the flour, the salt fish, the wood, she went over all of it, and it came out to enough, but only just, and only if the winter stayed no worse than it had been. The ice had closed the road to the point weeks since. There would be no easy load of anything come out from the town until the thaw. 2 keepers and an old man and a lamp that had to burn every night from dusk to dawn on what stood in the storehouse, and no more. She set the last of the oil cans in a row where she could count them without moving them, and she saw that the winter had drawn a line she had not drawn herself, that from here to the spring there was no margin left for another mistake, of hers or the weather's, and that the next storm to come down the lake would find the station with exactly as much oil and exactly as many hands as it had that night, and not one drop or one pair more. The lake gave up the first of its lost ones to the station in the last week of January. It came in the tail of a 2-day blow on a night when the snow ran level, and the cold behind it was the deep, still cold that follows a big wind. Elsie was in the lantern room, feeding the flame its warm oil, when she saw the lights on the water where no lights should have been. A set of running lights, low and close in, heeled hard over, driving toward the shoal off the point's north side. She knew the shape of the trouble before she knew the boat. It was a vessel that had lost her hold on the lake. The fishing schooner Marin, out of the town, torn from her winter moorings by the blow and driven back onto a shore she could not see. And Elsie did the thing Samuel had told her about on a night years gone, the thing she had nodded at and not thought of since. She worked the light. She did not only let it burn and sweep, she turned it and shaded it, trying to lay the beam along the one line of deep water through the shoal, to make of it not a warning, but a road. But the glass was rimed with the night's ice, and her hands were slow with cold and the long watch, and she could not hold the beam as clean and steady on the channel as Samuel once had. The Marin found the safe line, but late, and at the edge of it, close enough that she came up not on the rocks that would have opened her, but on the long sand spit at the foot of the point, hard aground and beaten but whole. It was a saving, but a rough one. Elsie stood at the lamp with her heart going, and knew she had done the thing half right, and that half right had been enough this once by the width of a hull, and might not be the next. There were 5 men aboard the Marin, and they came off her across the shore ice in the dark, following the one light on the point to the foot of the tower, and Elsie and Nan went down and brought them in. They were in a bad way, soaked to the waist from the waiting, stiffening fast in the still cold, one of them so far gone he had stopped shivering, which is the sign the old lake men fear most. Elsie got them into the thick-walled lower room where Halloran lay and the stove burned, and she set about the work the station had always done. It was work she knew in her hands from 9 years of it, because a light on a lakeshore is not only a light, it is the nearest warm door for miles, and the men it saves come to it half dead and have to be brought back the right way, or the bringing back kills them. She did not let them crowd the stove, though every one of them wanted to. A body chilled to the core cannot take the fire all at once. She warmed them from the outside in, slow, wrapped and held back from the heat at first, and brought to it by inches, and she gave them broth by the spoonful rather than let them gulp it. The one who had stopped shivering she worked over longest, and by the small hours he had come back to himself enough to shiver again, and to weep with the ache of the blood returning to his feet, and to be ashamed of the weeping. And Elsie turned to her kettle and let the man have that much privacy, the way Samuel always had. The station was a rescue post. It always had been. The stores, the boat on the slip, the line, the warm, strong room, the knowing how. None of it was the light, and all of it was the reason the light was worth keeping. The saving cost her the first of what the winter would take. To hold the beam on the channel, she had worked the lamp and scraped the outer glass on the open gallery, and no one can do the fine work of a lamp or take the ice off a pane in mittens, and so she had done it bare-handed in the wind off the ice for the better part of an hour. When it was over and the men were warming, she found that 2 fingers of her right hand had gone white and hard to the second knuckle and had no feeling in them at all. She knew what that was. She had seen it on lakemen her whole life. She wrapped the hand and said nothing to Nan, who had trouble enough, and told herself the fingers would come back. Some of them would. Not all of them, and not all the way. But she did not know that yet, and would not let herself think it. For the first time that winter, the lower room of the Light was full. The 5 men of the Marin, and Halloran on his cot, and Nan going among them with the kettle, and the stove roaring, and wet wool steaming on every line Elsie could rig, and the smell of broth and lake water, and men come back from the cold. The room that had been a widow's and an old man's grew loud and close and alive, and Elsie stood in the middle of it with a wrapped hand held behind her, and felt something she had not felt since October, which was the old feeling of the station doing the thing it was for. But she saw the other side of it too, and could not help seeing it, that 6 more men eat and burn and drink, and that the oil she had set in its careful row was going down now at a rate the careful row had never allowed for. The weather gave a window in 2 days, and the men of the Marin went down over the shore ice to the town, and they carried the story with them the way saved men do. They told it in the store, and on the church steps, and at every table that would have them, that the light on the point had taken them off the lake in the worst of the blow, that the beam had shown them the one safe line to the sand when the rocks were a boat length off, that the widow up there had brought them back from the cold in the warm stone room and fed them and asked nothing. They did not say the widow. By the end of the telling, they were saying the keeper up at the point, and no one in the town set them right, and the word went out of the store on its own legs. It reached most of the town as a wonder. It reached the district as a matter already settled. Whatever the fisherman said in the store, the appointment had been decided in an office far from the water, and the next mail out over the ice before it closed again carried a note from the board, courteous and final and unmoved, confirming that Mr. Reddick would take up the post in the spring as arranged. The gratitude of a boat's crew was not a thing the board weighed. The rule was the thing the board weighed, and the rule had not shifted because a light had saved 5 men. The light had only done what a light was for. So the last week of January closed with the station having done its work and paid for it. The Marin's men were alive and ashore, but 2 of Elsie's fingers were nipped and would not warm, and the oil stood lower in its row than it should have this side of February, and the town's good word had bought her nothing with the men who held her post. On the last night of the month, banking the lamp, she looked out at the northwest and did not like what she saw. The sky was settling onto the lake again, low and flat and silent, the way it had before the first great blow, only heavier. Not a storm. She had learned the difference now. This was the one the whole winter had been walking toward, and it was coming. And it would find her with nipped hands and a low store of oil, and a beam she could hold only half as true as the man whose road it was. The storm that had been walking toward the point all winter arrived on the first night of February, and it came as ice. It began as rain, which was the worst thing it could have been. A cold rain off a warmer reach of the Great Lake, driving in on a wind already hauling round to the north and dropping colder by the hour. The rain froze where it struck. It froze on the rigging of the boats drawn up in the town, and on the rails of the pier, and on the black rocks of the point, and on the wire of the fences and the bent few trees, until by full dark the whole shore was cased in ice and groaning under the weight of it. And it froze on the glass of the lantern room, on the outside of the great storm panes, faster than any keeper alive could have kept it clear. Elsie saw it start and knew what it meant before the first pane had glazed over. She was up the stair with a scraper and a cloth, working the outside of the glass from the gallery in a wind that tried to take her off the rail, and it was no use. She cleared a pane and turned to the next, and the first had frozen again behind her. The beam that should have reached 10 miles into the storm began to dim and to blind in patches as the ice built on the glass, throwing a broken, guttering light that a ship could not have read and a lost man could not have found. And there were both out there in the dark. There was a vessel somewhere on the lake. She had seen its lights an hour before, standing in too close, and there was the town below, its houses beginning, one after another, to lose their fires to the wind and go black. It was then, at the top of the tower with her hands failing and the light going out under the ice, that the whole of what Samuel had told her came back. Not the words this time, but the thing beneath the words. A stranger out there saw a light. A keeper showed him the road. The light was not to be lit, it was to be aimed. And she saw, with the clarity that comes to a person at the bottom of a bad night, that she had been trying to do a thing that could not be done. To hold the whole great sweep of the glass clear and shining against an ice storm, with 2 hands and one of them half dead. And that she did not need to. She did not need to light the whole horizon. She needed to light one road. So she gave up the horizon. She chose the one sector of glass that threw the beam along the line of the channel, the road of deep water through the shoal that Samuel had shown a schooner years before. And she put everything she had into that single pane and let the rest of the glass ice over and go dark. She scraped that one sector clear and fed the flame hot behind it and scraped it clear again when the ice came back, over and over, through the black hours, so that where there had been a broken, useless glare all around the tower, there was now one narrow, strong beam laid down hard along the one line a ship could live on. It was not a lighthouse throwing its light to the whole lake. It was a keeper holding a single road open in the dark with her own 2 ruined hands, and it was the thing the lake had wanted of her all along. The vessel came out of the white a little before the worst of the night. It was a lake steamer, small and low and iced to the waterline, driving in half blind for the harbor with her people at the end of what they could do. And she was running straight for the rocks of the North Shoal on a line that would have opened her like the Marin, and worse. And then her helmsman found the beam. Not the broken glare, but the one narrow road of it laid down clean on the deep water. And he understood what he was being shown, as a lake man understands such things. And he brought her over onto that line and held her there. And she came through the gap of deep water with the rocks a stone's throw off either hand, and never touched. Elsie did not see it happen. She was scraping glass. She heard it after from the steamer's mate, that they had every one of them given themselves up for lost, and that out of the blind storm a road of light had opened on the black water, and they had walked the ship down it into the lee of the point, and safe.
And while the beam held its one road for the ship, the tower did the other thing a light does that no one names until the night they need it. On the shore below, the ice storm took the town's houses one after another, froze the stoves, cracked the pipes, drove the cold through the thin frame walls until a family could not stay in its own kitchen. And the people came out into the killing night, looking for the one thing still standing and still warm and still lit. And the one thing was the tower. They came up the point in the dark, following the glow of the lantern room as the ship had followed the beam, and they came to the foot of the great stone tower that held its heat and its light against everything the lake could throw at it, because it was built to, and because a widow was keeping it lit. There was an hour in the dead middle of that night when Elsie nearly let it go. Her hands had stopped hurting, which she knew was the worst sign, and the cold and the tiredness spoke to her in a voice that was terribly reasonable. It told her to stop, to let the ice have the glass and lie down on the lantern room floor where it was warm, and sleep. The post was not hers past the spring. A man named Reddick would climb these stairs in April and be handed the light. Let him have the freezing of his own hands. And beneath that voice was an uglier one that said these were the Board's people down on her stair, the town that had watched her measured for the door, and let them find their own road. She stood at the iced glass and shook and listened to both of them, and then Nan's voice came up the stair, that there were people at the foot of the tower to be let in, and a light still out on the water needing the beam, and Elsie put her dead hands back on the scraper. The light held because she was a keeper. Whose people they were and whose post it was no part of the keeping and no business of hers that night. So the light on the point did, in one night, more than it had done in 9 quiet years. It laid its road down for the steamer and brought her through. It stood over the town like a fire on a hill and drew the freezing in out of the dark. The people came up the stair, and Elsie and Nan took them into the thick-walled lower room, and the steamer's crew came off the ice and up the slip, and by the black middle of the night, there were more souls in the tower than had ever sheltered there, in the lower room, on the stairs, wrapped on the lantern room floor in the warmth off the lamp. Nan went among them with the kettle, and, because she was a keeper's daughter, wrote them into the log as they came, the count of them, where each was from, the ship on the line, in her careful hand, the way the station had always kept its record. It would matter, that log, though none of them thought of it that night. The storm pressed a full day, and then, in the second night, began to ease, and the third morning came up glassy and terrible and still. The whole point stood cased in ice and glittering in the low sun, the tower a white spike of it against a hard blue sky, and the lake beyond lay gray and heaving and empty. 19 people in all, the steamer's crew among them, woke in the tower into a warmth they had walked through a killing night to reach. The saving was no longer a thing between Elsie and the rocks. It had 19 witnesses and a steamer's master, and it had a line in a station log and a girl's careful hand. The cost came due when the work was done and the shaking stopped. In the stillness after the storm, Elsie unwrapped her hands and looked at what the night had taken. The right hand, nipped back in January, had never wholly come back, and one finger of it was gone hard past saving.
The left, that she had worked barest against the iced glass through the worst of the night, had taken it worse. 2 fingers of it white and dead to the second knuckle, past the point where any warmth would bring them home. She would lose the ends of the 3 of them, and the left hand would never again close all the way. She wrapped them once more before Nan could see, and she went down among the people in the lower room and poured out soup with her ruined hands hidden in her sleeve, and said nothing. Because the light had led a ship down its road, and the tower had held the town through the worst night of the winter, and the fingers were only what it had cost to do it. The word went down the shore ahead of the ice. The steamer's people, once the storm let them go, carried what had happened out into the country the way saved men carry such things, thoroughly and more than once. In the town and in the next town, and at every landing up and down that stretch of shore where a lake man would listen, they told it. That on the worst night the lake had thrown in 20 years, when their ship was a length off the rocks and blind, a road of light had opened on the black water and walked them through the one gap of deep water into the lee of the point. And that the light had been kept, that night and all the hard winter behind it, by the widow the board had told to leave in the spring. By the time the ice began to soften on the lake, there was not a soul on that shore who did not know the name of the keeper at the point, and none of them said it with a widow in front of it any longer. Amos Reddick came out to the point as soon as the ice would let a boat land in the first mild week of April to take up the post the board had given him. He was not a bad man, and not a fool. He had kept lights himself for years, and knew one when he stood in it. He had come expecting to relieve a widow who had held on through a hard season out of grief and stubbornness, and to take a run-down station gently off her hands. What he found was a light in perfect order, a log kept to the letter, a slip sanded and a stair roped, a tower sound from the base to the lantern, and a shore full of people who spoke of the keeper there the way men speak of someone they owe their lives to. He stood on the point in the spring sun and understood, before ever he climbed the stair, that he had been sent to replace something that did not need replacing. Elsie did not tell him about the night the light went blind. She told him nothing of the aimed beam or the freezing hands or the people on the stair. She brought out the station log instead and set it in front of him. The whole winter of it, in her hand and Halloran's and Nan's. The date of every lighting and every extinguishing, the weather of every night, the oil burned and the oil left. And, on the pages of that last week, the plain record of a ship brought through and 19 souls sheltered, entered in a girl's careful hand with no more fuss than a barrel of oil received. She did not offer it as a defense. She offered it the way a keeper hands the log to the keeper who comes after. This is the station. This is how it stands. This is what was done and what it cost. And Reddick, turning the pages, read the columns and understood the language he was being spoken to, because it was his own. It was the language of the watch, and there was no arguing with it, because it was all true and all written down. He did not say a great deal. He was a keeper, and keepers do not. But before he left the tower, he told her, plainly, that he did not see how he was to improve on the light that was already being kept, and that he would say as much to the board. And he sat at her own table and wrote it while she watched. And at the door, with his hat in his hand, he said one thing more, that Samuel Vare had kept a good light, and that it had gone on being a good light, which was not a thing a station could always say of the year after it lost its keeper. Elsie said only that the light was still kept. She did not say by whom, and she did not need to, and she took no more from the moment than that. It was not in her to stand in her own tower and crow over a man who had come to do his duty and found there was no duty to do. It did not rest on Reddick's word alone. That spring, a petition went to the board over the signatures of half the shore, the master of the Marin and his crew, the steamer's people, the fishermen, the families the tower had taken in on the ice storm night, asking that the keeper who had brought them all through the winter be left to keep the light. Reddick's report went with it, and the record of the log behind that. The Lighthouse Board did not often bend its practice, but a rule is one thing on paper in an office, and another thing set against a ship brought through a killing storm and 19 people carried off the ice, and a shore that had put its name to the truth of it. The board bent. Elsie Vare was appointed keeper of the light on that point in her own name, one of the few women on the whole lake to hold such a post, with Nan named her assistant, and old Halloran kept on to mind the lower watch as long as he was able. She kept it for a long time after. Every autumn, she laid the station in for winter, the way she had learned to that first hard year. Oil up top, in reserve by the stove, the slip sanded, the stair roped, the tower drawn in tight and warm. Every winter she carried the warm oil up the 60 feet of stair through the freezing nights and held the beam strong. And when a storm came down blind, she did not only light the lamp, she aimed it, laid it down as a road along the one line of deep water, as Samuel had shown her and the ice storm had taught her for good. The fishermen of that shore came to teach their children a simple thing, the way shore people teach children the few truths that keep them alive. That on a night when you cannot see, you steer for the light on the point, and you trust it to show you the road. And when a new steamer line began to run that stretch of the lake, its boats ran by her beam, so that the light the board had meant to hand to a man went on doing, year after year, the work the widow had held it to through the worst winter anyone remembered. She kept the light 22 years. Her left hand never closed all the way again, and on the coldest nights, the stumps of the lost fingers ached her, and every fisherman on that shore knew why, and not one of them ever asked, because more than one of them had come home up her beam. In the lantern room, the great brass lamp stood polished every day by a hand that was short 3 fingers, and it never once went dark on her watch. When at last she was too old for the stair, Nan took up the post after her, keeper in her own name in her turn, and the light on the point passed from a mother's ruined hands to a daughter's whole ones, without ever once going out. The board had had a man in mind for a post. That was the whole of the world's arrangement, and it was a reasonable arrangement, written down in a warm office far from the water. And then the lamp had gone blind with ice on the worst night of the winter, and the town had come up her stairs in the dark, and a ship had walked a road of light through the rocks and lived, and the arrangement in the end did not survive the night. Any fool can light a lamp. That was the thing Samuel had said, and the thing the winter proved. A lighthouse is not the lamp. It is the keeper, the one who will freeze the fingers off her own hand to hold the beam true on the night a ship's whole company is riding on it. And for 22 more years, on that stretch of Lake Michigan, the boats held their course by the aimed light of a widow the board had once meant to send away. If this story brought to mind someone who held their own light steady when the world had already decided someone else would take their place, leave their name in the comments. And if you'd like to hear more of these stories, the women the frontier underestimated and what they quietly knew how to do, subscribe. We tell them one at a time, a whole hour at a time, and we don't rush them.